My pleasure today is to introduce Andy, Anya and Abby, all from Collective Impact Agency. They're going to tell you about sort of their story, invite us into discussion and all the rest of it. But loosely speaking, the theme for today was around changing organisations, changing systems. Again, they'll give you the depth on it, but it was partly born out of a conversation about what's the relationship between changing systems and changing the component parts of those systems. So if, for instance, we're thinking about place-based partnerships, if you leave the discrete institutions alone in the middle of that and just try and get them collaborating, does that work or does that not work? And I think this links, again, keep me straight, Collective Impact Agency colleagues, but I think this links to the work that you guys have been doing on your own organisation, your own ways of working, moving away from conventional or not getting ensconced in conventional hierarchy and going straight to collective management. Yeah. Yep. So the spirit of these sessions is always we get a stimulus from those who lead us off, Andy, Anya and Abby, and then we just have a discussion and see where it leads us. So I think without further ado, over to yourselves.
Thanks very much, Andy, and hi everybody. I know a couple of you and don't know a couple of you, so nice to meet those of you who I don't know. Andy's introduced me, Andy, Collective Impact Agency. You'll get a sense of who I am the more I talk, I reckon, the more I blather on. Yeah, so the sort of provocation we wanted to start with was this idea of, in order to change systems, we need to change organizations. I think oftentimes when we get into conversations about changing systems, those conversations can often go down as people just saying like, we just need people to behave differently. We just need people to do different things, and that will be sufficient to create the sort of impact that we're looking for, the sort of change that we're looking for. But we don't think that's true. We don't think that's accurate or the full story, because for all of us, human behavior, it's significantly a product of the environment in which we find ourselves, and different structures promote very different kinds of behavior. So if we want to change systems, assuming that people are comfortable with the language of system change, I'm not going to dig into that here and now, then what we need to do, one of the things we need to do, is rethink and reinvent the environments or the institutions and the organizations that make up those systems. So the idea here is fundamentally what we need is we need new organizations and we need new institutions. And I think that's quite a big and bold suggestion, and we're happy to explore any part of that. But certainly our way into that is to talk about what we're trying to do in Collective Impact Agency, which is a company that existed on paper for the first time 3 years ago, almost 3 years to the day. Began actually doing stuff 2.5 years ago. That was me on a part-time basis, and then over the past couple of years, we've grown to become 5 people, which is where we are now. But we have been very consciously and painstakingly trying to craft a different kind of organization. So as Andy's indicated, one part of that is being self-managing. We don't have line management relationships with one another. We have human relationships with one another. We don't have a strategy as an organization. We have broad things that we care about, broad areas of interest. But then within that frame, all of the individuals have the freedom to explore and to get new stuff started. We're incredibly relational in how we work both inside and outside the organization, which takes a phenomenal amount of time, which is something I dare say we'll talk about more over the course of this. But we're 2 years into this experiment of developing a different kind of organization, and it's not always easy and it's not always straightforward, but certainly from my perspective, it is amazing. It is incredibly freeing. It's often terrifying. But chatting to Abby the other day, Abby said that in the past 18 months that she's been in the organization, she's noticed that the massive impact, the massive changes, and just a different environment have had on her. So I'm just going to hand over to Abby to let her jump in on that.
Hi everyone, I'm Abby. So a realization I came to reasonably recently was looking back at the gulf between now and 18 months ago, December 2020 it was when I started at Collective Impact Agency. And the amount of stuff and different stuff and exciting stuff that I've done and got involved in that time is quite phenomenal, really. And I think the rate of change and the rate of work has been really exciting, and working on crafting this sort of what we like to think of as a different kind of organization. I previously worked in a series of very sort of traditional, conventional kind of organizations, and it was only as we've been going through this conscious process of unpicking how we want to be as an organization, what kind of organization do we want to be, and because we're a small organization, we really have the time and the space to explore that. A conversation Andy and I had very, very early on when I started at Collective Impact Agency was about the amount of unlearning that you do when you move from one organization to another, particularly when we're trying to do things in a very human-centered way instead of accepting this is how you do organizations based on our previous experiences. And what I found is that I don't think I quite appreciated quite how much unlearning there was to do, but more than that, quite how much working in this very sort of traditional kind of way made me into a different sort of person than the kind of person that I am when all of that is taken away. And that process of unlearning and the process of working out how I want to be is hard work, but it's really exciting. But now when I look back at who I am now and how I feel about my work, how I feel about who I am, this sounds a little bit what's the word? I can't think of a word that isn't a swear word, and I don't know if I'm all right to swear in this space. So just imagine a swear word.
You're with a Glaswegian, so it's acceptable.
All right. Well, at the risk of sounding a bit wanky, I just feel I feel a lot more like I'm a different person now to the one I was before, but I'm more me than I was before, if that makes sense. And a lot of that is from unpicking what about how I work and how I want to be at work, and how I want to be in relation with my colleagues is so much informed by the structure and the way of working of the organisation that you are in, that it's quite easy, now I look back on it, to find it difficult to untangle what are the things that are about you as a person, and what are the behaviours that you exhibit and the beliefs that you hold are about the organisation and the way that the organisation works. And that process of untangling all of those threads and going, if I took all of those shackles off, how would I want to work? How would I want to be? Who would I want to be? Has been really exciting. And it's still a continual learning process. I don't think it's stopping anytime soon. But yeah, it's for me, I feel like it's a really positive way to just start trying to reimagine how an organisation could be, by starting with, if we rejected all of the conventions that we're so used to working within, what could we be? Who could we be? Andy, I think I'm handing back to you. I don't know what just happened there. I assume my 4-year-old is fine. Let's go check.
Thanks, Abby. So Anya joined CIA just over a year ago. Anya, do you want to comment on your first year with the organisation?
It's been awful. Oh no, it hasn't. I mean, everything that Abby's saying really resonates. I think it's the thing that you said that really stuck with me was about that the fact that you can even ask that question of how do I want to be, is really unusual. Like, it's not normally a question that you can really ask yourself because you're within such tight confines. I guess my experience has been, in all honesty, it has been up and down at points, but it's definitely mostly been up. As like, I'm sure we'll all explore aloud together later on. Like, this is really challenging work, and we did talk about that in the podcast as well. It's really, it can require a huge amount of emotion and vulnerability in order to kind of have those conversations and try and figure out really messy, tricky situations that have had such a tradition, like pay, for example, where there's such a tradition of how that's done, and there's so many formulas as to how that's worked out. And when we're trying to figure out different ways of doing that, it's a minefield, actually. And there's so many conflicting needs and wants, and everything so different, that yeah, sometimes it can just be an enormous challenge. And I have had points where I think, why are we doing this? Why aren't we just doing it how it's done? Because that is so much easier. But the reality is that I don't really know how to express this, but I just really appreciate that what we're trying to do is really think about the people who make up the company. And if I wasn't here, or if Andy wasn't there, we would be having different conversations, and our priorities would be different, and the kind of the ways that we choose to do things would look really different, because our interests and our experiences and our lenses and our biases are all different. So trying to come up with things that work for our organization, but with the people in the center and the people in mind, feels really exciting. I've never ever been part of a process like that. And I definitely feel like I wrote a blog actually not long after I started at CIA, where I described myself as that I feel like I often end up becoming the kind of the annoying braying donkey in an organization, because I'm quite confident about the things that I believe in, and I'm not afraid to say those things. But often I feel like that's kind of hit this kind of wall of hierarchy, or of some kind of policy or something that really doesn't make sense, that's kind of in the way. And I feel like I've kind of ended up almost having a bit of a reputation, which I don't like, and maybe that's a really gendered thing too. But what's really great is that I don't, for who I am, but also that saying actually I don't agree with that doesn't make me a braying donkey. It just means that I don't agree with something. Okay, well, let's reevaluate. We all need to feel okay about this thing, and yes, that takes time and effort, but it feels really validating. And I know validation is maybe not something we should all seek and crave, but that is human nature. So yeah, I guess that's all I'd say at this point. A lot of challenge though. I'm aware that we've definitely come into this going, we're really great, and that's like not necessarily always the case, for sure.
Just a final thought from me, and then I'll invite everybody else to come into the conversation. So I find myself talking about learned helplessness a lot at the moment, and noticing all kinds of ways in which our current structures of institutions and organizations actually teach people to be helpless. Anya's uncovered some of this in some of the community work in Gateshead that she's been doing recently. My friend Andy and I have had conversations about the damage that power over relationship does to people. And yet that's how we standardly choose to organize. And I think this phenomenon of learned helplessness I think it's a really important concept for any sort of bold change, because I think it can be very easy to just posit, well, people can just do things differently, but the weight of expectation, the weight of understanding, the whole cognitive framework that people are carrying contributes to this idea of what they can and cannot do. Like, it's been fascinating. If self-management is something that people are interested in, we can talk about that. One thing we found really interesting is that we've deliberately set ourselves up as a non-hierarchical organization with no line management relationships, and yet the ways in which hierarchy have played out in our interactions with one another is stuff that we're only now really grappling with, only now understanding to any degree. because that's what we've learned. We've all learned hierarchy. And another thing I find myself saying a lot is you can't just say there's no hierarchy and make it the case, because of everything, all of this baggage that people carry with them. Yeah, so you've heard a bit from all three of us.
Can I just come in quickly, Andy, and say that it's not just about the baggage that people carry, it's also about the structural injustices that exist and the kind of the different forces that are into play. It's not just about the baggage that people have. Like, there are many forces that many of us are fighting against every day. I think that's really, really worth like highlighting. Sorry.
It's all right. I was just going to say, hopefully you've heard something from at least one of the three of us that you find interesting. So which parts, if any, of what we've said would you like to explore aloud with us?
So just so that no one's expecting that I'm going to chair this or anything, I will chair if a rabble breaks out. Otherwise, it's over to you, team.
Gosh, well, Andy, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in because my mind is racing already. So I need to share and organize and reflect back. So firstly, just a quick hello to everyone. I'm Sebastian de Morelos. I'm a learning and organizational development consultant working at Croydon Council, one of London's largest boroughs. I've been working there since 2015. And I work a lot currently on projects which are at the intersection between the good work I like to use the good work. That's kind of probably me stating my values here. That's going on the ground, particularly around community engagement and the work of enabling the work of the community and voluntary sector, and working alongside the institutions that are there to presumably support that activity on the ground, and encountering the numerous barriers which I'm sure a lot of people on the call in their own field of work will have probably encountered in terms of how we find ourselves often constrained by the structures in which we operate. I certainly, as part of a local government authority, encounter that on a daily basis. And I'm getting to a point where I'm very conscious of the oppressive nature of that. It's not just for me as an individual, but actually how it oppresses us collectively when we're trying to investigate and experiment and innovate in the field of public service. So working, for example, to enable adult social care to work alongside our health services to deliver better services for our residents. That's one of the projects that I'm currently involved in. So this whole notion of enabling structures really, really interests me and is an area that I'm currently researching from my perspective as an organizational development consultant. I find it really courageous hearing you talking about your current experience of forming this organization for you and really challenging yourselves to rethink how you work as a collective. And I empathize with the pain that must sometimes induce. I have no doubt in my mind that it requires a huge amount of patience. So I guess what I'm interested in exploring aloud today is firstly this notion that you've introduced about learned helplessness. I'd love for us to unwrap that a little bit more. What does that exactly represent? Learned helplessness, because I can see that from a various number of angles, and I think that's really powerful. And secondly, I guess, is this idea of, in some respects, what you've done is you've stepped out of the numerous systems that we know govern the way that people live their lives, and you've decided to kind of start with a blank slate almost, but then you haven't, because no one does. We all come from the learned behaviors that we carry over into the next project that we bring. So I'm curious about that, because clearly I'm still feeling like I'm very much stuck in that old world way of being and existing and collaborating with my work colleagues. And I sometimes ask myself, can I ever change that system from the inside, or do I just have to settle for the fact that I need to get out of that system to make any change? That's one of the questions that I've been struggling with professionally, which I want to share. That's part of my kind of exploring aloud proposition.
I'm happy to
On
go.
Sam, jump in.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Sebastian, as well as the original speakers. As always, well, as nearly always the case of these, I've kind of got this, you've given me kind of so many different things to think about, and I'm trying to sort of think what are the kind of some salient points to put forward, and maybe attempting to try and be at least vaguely coherent when I try and make them still. So I think all of you kind of touched on things that, yeah, I could definitely relate to, including you as well, Sebastian, at the end. But that thing about, I think there was actually no one individual said particularly about how your experiences at the CIA have kind of shaped you as an individual a bit more. And I find that really interesting, because that's part of it. So I do my job around, trying to change things. I also work for a council. And I think it's often assumed that how we show up at work is because of our lives outside of work. But I also think an important part of kind of what we often try and, an outcome of what we're trying to do is actually, if we can change things at work, then that actually might change the way people show up outside of work as well. Because, we spend 8 hours a day, many of us, at work 5 days a week. And if you're going to work each day, and perhaps if that's all you've known since you kind of left education, is you kind of turn up at these kind of hierarchical organizations, and maybe where there is that aspect, as Andy was talking about, around kind of learned helplessness and sort of having to ask permission to do stuff and wait for the boss to allow you to do things, then that's going to shape how people show up in the world outside of work as well. And I wonder sometimes if there's not necessarily like a linear cause and effect there, but actually I wonder if there's something about that, because of that's the kind of norm for our organizations, that's why we end up with kind of such shitty leaders, and or even going beyond that in terms of how, you started the swearing off, Abby, by the way, so I'm carrying on with it, or how we end up with like such shitty institutions, which I've now sort of led to be the better question, right, that kind of produces these leaders, or actually do we even need institutions that are kind of based on this concept of kind of a hierarchical leadership and everything like that? So yeah, that's something that kind of really spoke to me about your experience, and it speaks to me personally as well, because I think how I've got to where I am in my views around how people in the world should perhaps best organize, actually a lot of that's come from stuff I've learned about at work around kind of all different things, really, around kind of systems thinking, complexity stuff, around kind of self-management type stuff, around working with communities, actually shaped how I make sense of the world myself now. And so I wonder, actually, if we change organizations, such on Andy Crosbie's last point around that kind of learned helplessness, is that's how it might influence it both inside and outside of work at the same time. And Sebastian, on that point around how we might show up at work, actually a lot of this has led me to take recently inspiration from dandelions, in terms of I'm an admirer of dandelions, because they manage to take root in really in conditions that perhaps aren't particularly good for it to take root. And also they spread when they dry, and my kids pick one up and blow on them, and the kind of the seeds spread everywhere. And I kind of, that's my approach within organizations now, to try and be a bit more like a dandelion, try and kind of create space and hold space, even if the conditions might not be so good, and then try and spread a few seeds while I'm at it as well. So I don't know if that was coherent at all. I can't even say the word, but yeah, that's sort of some of my thoughts from what everyone said.
I think you'll like this comment about dandelions, Sam. So in Australia, the white dry dandelions are called Father Christmases.
Oh, yes, I do.
Because of the bushy beard, but also you're spreading gifts.
Yes, yeah, really like it.
Makes more sense than dandelion clocks. Why?
You
Andy, do you have something? Yeah, do you have something you want to say, Andy? Because I have a whole bunch of stuff.
If I may come in, yeah, come in with just something quick. I would like to explore the learned helplessness stuff more, as especially Sebastian has highlighted. Just wanted to, like, there's a book it's broadly a leadership book. It's called Maverick, if anybody's come across it. And there was a line in that which really resonated with me, which was democracy is yet to penetrate the workplace. And I think that's core to what we're talking about here. So, when I talk about new organizations and new institutions, I'm talking about democratic structures as much as anything here. And we think ourselves as living in a democracy, but as Sam said, we spend 8 hours a day at work, and most of our lived experience is not in democratic structures. It's in hierarchical, often autocratic structures. So that's what people know. People know bosses. People know orders, and people wonder why more people don't engage with representative democratic processes when it's the time for an election. It's because people live in these environments day in, day out, where they have very little power, very little say, and are unable to influence anything. So why will voting for another bugger, my turn, change anything? That was it from me just then, Abby.
I feel like it's a challenge now. Everyone has to swear at least. Well, you don't have to swear at least once. I wanted to jump in on partly on the work-life question, and also the learned helplessness one, interlinked. One of them is, as you've already said, Sam, we spend so much of our time at work. So much, quite a very significant proportion of most people's lives is spent in the working environment. So this notion of work-life balance is one that I feel increasingly uncomfortable about, because it insinuates that work isn't part of life. Whereas if it's not, then like who's the person who's existing in those 8 hours in which you're working in the day? And so for me, finding a way to see the person who is at work and the person who is outside of work as one whole, I think is one of the things that we're trying to do. And for me is a really important thing, which is why this human-centered way of working for me feels really vital to sort of freeing people up to being their best selves at work, and also giving one another the sort of flexibility and the freedom to be supportive when things are challenging, and to elevate one another when things are going really well, and also the places in the middle. The point I wanted to make around learned helplessness, maybe slightly tangentially, is one of the things that I think has changed for me, moving from conventional hierarchical spaces where the level of value equated with a person's opinion is directly correlated with where they sit in the hierarchy. Like the people at the very bottom of the pyramid are more expendable than the people a bit nearer the top. Whereas when we're trying to upend that, as Anya's spoken about having opinions and them being respected, for me, I think now if I went into a more conventional organisation, people would really struggle to shut me up in a way that they might have done before. And Andy was my line manager in a previous organisation. I think he quite struggled to shut me up then, but now it's never going to happen. I have much greater conviction in my opinions because they carry more weight in this space. And therefore, I think that means, and bringing us to the point of changing about creating organisations that are fit for and useful for system change type behaviours. For me, that's partly being willing to take risks and to be openly challenging when perhaps previously, and partly, as, again, alluding to Anya's point about structural inequities that we experience, I might have sort of maybe cosseted my opinion in slightly softer terms, or sort of like dialed it down a little bit because of where I might have been in a previous organizational hierarchy. Whereas now I have no qualms about telling people things that I think they need to hear, obviously in as nice a way as I possibly can, but not sort of varnishing the truth when I think that actually it's more valuable to tell people the things that I've observed, but not allowing myself to dial back due to my perception of how I am in relation to the other people. And I think that's directly correlated with how I try to be in this kind of working environment.
I also wanted
chuck a thing in. Sorry, Anya, did you
go
want
for
to
it. Go for it.
Well, I just wanted to pick up the learned helplessness point, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to make this coherent at all, but so in this space, we've got learned helplessness, we've got psychological safety, we've got, seek forgiveness, not permission type stuff, and logics around control. And these are all things that I hear referenced regularly in organizations that are in some way interested in this sort of area. I think the thing that I'm interested in around this is it's not that those things are red herrings or irrelevant or anything like that, but the slight disquiet I have about each of them is that if we make the work that we're doing about those things, I wonder if we reinforce the paradigm that produces them. So what I mean is, if we make it about psychological safety, do we make the conversation, therefore the terms of the debate, oh God, am I safe? And now I'm unsafe because I'm even asking that question. Or if we make it about permission, does that reinforce hierarchy? Because it's like, well, who do I need to look to for the permission giving? So the question I'm holding about those things, I think this goes to learned helplessness as well. You know, if we make it about helplessness, does that create helplessness? Is whether we need to make it about responsibility. So I'm either responsible or I'm not, and that's on me. And then the disquiet I have even about that, because that appeals to me, is the point that was being made around the structural inequalities that exist. And it's easier for some people, arguably, to embrace their agency, take responsibility, those things, than for others. But the question I'm still holding in that is that the very is that the very reason to make it about responsibility? Because in a sense, the current system almost gives permission to not use your agency. Whereas if the future system just created a baseline expectation of you have responsibility, the question is, are you using it? Whether that would be the way out of this. So again, without trying to state conclusions, they're just a whole mess of thoughts that occur to me about this.
I think that's really interesting, and it kind of falls in line with, you know, kind of more asset-based growth or development, or whatever word you want to put on the end of that, and that celebrating the positive element is, or like even how you might train a dog. You know, you tell her she's a good girl when she does a good thing. You don't tell her she's a bad girl when she does a bad thing, because that's not necessarily gonna change the behavior. But if you reinforce the positives, then they're more likely to want to do the thing because they get biscuits, and biscuits are great. So that makes sense. But I also think it's okay to see the other side, because that's how we understand kind of concepts. So if you think about light, we know it's light and sunny because there is no darkness. So we have to be able to see both, but also I think it is how we understand the world, that if we talk about responsibility, we might also then start feeling, oh, I don't have responsibility, or I have too much responsibility. So I think that lack will always be there, that not lacking thing, but like the focus on the lack, if you know what I mean. I don't know if that makes sense. And I feel like everything that everyone's kind of touched on this a bit, and I wanted to come back to something that Sebastian said earlier about why looking at our organizations is really important. And I think my experience directly links to councils as well, where community members don't see themselves as being able to step into a decision-making space, because they've always been told it doesn't belong to them. But when you ask them who their beef is with, they say the council. If you ask them like where their problems lie, it's the council. You ask them what should be fixed, they tell you exactly what needs to happen. And you ask them who should be deciding these things, and they say the council. So there's no like understanding in there's a limit of understanding or kind of confidence in communities that people can step into those decision-making spaces, because the hierarchy exists within all of our society. I don't just think it's within our organizations, but whilst we've been doing our community work in Gateshead and finding out these things and asking these questions, we've actually been berated by a local councillor, for asking the question, what's strong and what's wrong in the community. And they said that we shouldn't be asking what's wrong because it's not our place. And so even that is really interesting, that because of the ideas of how decisions are made, or how things are questioned, or how growth happens, or whatever it might be, that there's a really specific idea of what that looks like within a council, for example, as I'm sure you, like you say, you face that every day. And that then makes it really hard to then relate to a community, and there's no flexibility, and there's very little adaptability, because that hierarchy and that kind of lineage sort of exists. So then the community respond in the same way, which is, well, I can't fix it, you should fix it, you're the council. And then you end up in this horrible cycle, and no one really is able to kind of do the right things, or the things that are actually useful, because the right questions aren't being asked by the right people, or whatever. I don't know, I'm starting to not make sense, I think, but I thought that point earlier, Sebastian, was really interesting, and it's definitely something that I've experienced in my work at CIA. And I think that one of the reasons I find it so challenging is partly because it's just not how we do things in our organization, and you're like, why can't you just not do that?
Thanks, Anya. I really appreciate your perspective on that, because it does resonate with a lot of the thoughts that have been coursing through my head. And the simple metaphor comes to my mind of, the tail wagging the dog, as opposed to the dog wagging its own tail. It's kind of, you wonder, first of all, who's the tail and who's the dog? So there's all that ambiguity within that process, within the work and the process of understanding what part you have as an individual within a wider system. And I'm thinking of that relationship again, which is absolutely crucial to the work that you've been involved in. And I hear you use the language of ABCD, and I recognize it because at Croydon we have great examples of asset-based community development that have been underway since long before even I joined, and have been exemplary in what they've achieved. So the paradox is that out there are some pockets of very strong communities who feel they have agency and feel empowered, and who believe in the power of community because they have seen it and they have experienced it. It's an embodied experience. This is what I always come back to when I go back to my dialogues in the institutions. So when I talk about institutions, I'm sure you'll understand, I'm talking about local authority, I'm talking about the NHS, I'm talking about those services. Even Age UK is an institution in some respects, even though it's a charity. So we talk to these parties and we say, unless you're working on the ground alongside those people, you're not going to feel it in your bodies, that embodied knowledge, which comes back to that sense of learned helplessness. I believe learned helplessness is partly driven by what we know, that we've embedded in ourselves, in our habits, and daily habits. So I do think that you're provoking me to think back to that initial proposition, Andy. You said at the beginning, we can't just focus on changing behaviors. That's not enough. We have to change structures. And I do agree with that statement, but I do think that they have to be held in balance. What do you think about that? Isn't there there's something about our personal behavior that has a crucial part to play in our ability to feel that we have any agency in changing any structure in a system? So they have to coexist somewhere, don't they? Just wondering what other people think about that.
There's a really lovely academic article about this, just for people who are interested in that sort of thing. It's called Social Structures and Their Threats to Agency. And what it essentially says is what we need we need to understand that social structures and individual agency are always going to be held in tension. They're always going to be, I want to say dramatic tension, that's not what I mean at all, dramatic pause. we have to recognize the effect that institutions and structures and environments have on the people who are in them. Recognize those influences, and actually recognize that we all need to be part of groups. We all need to belong. That's an important part of human flourishing. At the same time, individuals need to be able to adopt a separate perspective and look outside of their groups and environments and institutions in order to critique them. The article talks quite a bit about concentration camp guards, and is looking into the paradox of how you can have these individuals who are caring fathers in the evening with their families, and yet responsible for murdering thousands of people during the day. And that's where the balance between individual agency and social structures has gone. It's been lost.
I'm wondering if I'm kind of new to the group. I work for Healthcare Improvement Scotland. So we're a national NHS board across Scotland. And to make, that's not hard enough, having 14 regional boards and kind of the whole thing about the relationships and structures and self-organising. You could never start there because you would just go insane. The area I work in, Healthcare Improvement Scotland, we also work with the 31 health and social care partnerships. So that's 31 NHS and local authorities who come together kind of underneath the auspices of a legal entity, but they're not legal themselves. So you're bringing two different cultures, which are very similar in local authority and NHS together. So our work is we're working kind of with Toby Lowe at the moment about how we introduce HLS into Scotland and across health and social care to start changing that. But actually these things of how you organise within that is kind of very pertinent, because also add into that crazy mix of really proper institutions with their proper old-fashioned ways of working and hierarchy at its worst, add in community and third sector organisations who they have to work with, because actually that's what we need in our health and social care system, is the whole system working together. So kind of the thought within that about actually we need more organisations and structures just fills me with terror, because I just see kind of added on to existing ones that kind of don't want to give up their power. And certainly from what we've been doing, or what I've been doing in my role, is we try and spotlight those who are doing differently, kind of, and are doing different things and are challenging the norm. But yet again, I just reflected recently, the Scottish Government published something that basically gave permission to every public sector authority in Scotland to pause contracts, health and social care contracts, or extend them kind of in preparation for the new National Care Service. So that's in a policy note. And I'm not going to tell you how many have done that, but the majority have not done that. Kind of, so even when permission is given to kind of the public sector structures who are very hierarchical, kind of, but it's a learned helplessness. But again, kind of, even with it, you have all the permissions you need in order to do differently. Kind of, we're back to this kind of, oh well, we can't do it kind of thing, or we just don't know what to do, or how do we do it? Can somebody do it for us, sort of thing? And this is where kind of, I love the conversation happening here, but I find it really hard of how the only thing that I can take back is go back and use my position to either shine lights on things, to help people, give them permission, encourage them, bring them along. But in terms of looking at a national level, it just kind of fills me with kind of almost dreads that we're never going to move to kind of a structure. Can you imagine the NHS self-organising? That fills me equally with joy, thinking that that'd be great, and also terror, because the mess it would be.
I think that's if I may come in again, I think a lot of what you've kind of said is some stuff that I've seen on a much smaller scale in bits of work that I'm involved with, and I'm sure Andy and Abby have probably seen the same thing as well. One of the things that we've said at CIA is that we don't know how scalable this approach is. We know that putting people at the center is scalable, because that's what we need to start doing. But what we do at CIA, we don't know how far we can push that, and we actually want to put a bit of a cap on our organization as to how many people we think can work there before we feel like it's unmanageable. But that's very specifically about how we're doing what we are doing. and there's lots that people can play with. But I wanted to just say that what you're talking about in terms of having quite embedded and long-standing huge organizations like the NHS and local authorities working together. I'm part of a group in Gateshead where I'm working with the Adult Health and Social Care department and the NHS and the CCG and a couple of other people within Gateshead Council who want to make their services more digitally inclusive. And the reason why I'm kind of involved is because their approach is like, well, we'll just make really great digital services that are really accessible. And I keep saying to them, like, it doesn't matter how accessible your services are, people can't access the internet, they can't access your services. And so I'm there to try and broaden out their approach. And what's really fascinating is that we're starting to work together really well, even though capacity is quite low, but we're starting to kind of we're having really exciting conversations all the time, and there's kind of new bits coming from that, and it feels like a very level playing field, even though there's some very high up people that kind of sit in that group, and I often feel like I have imposter syndrome in that sense, but it feels very equal, which is really nice. But what still happens is that we have a wealth of community at our feet because we're in Gateshead, and there's loads and loads of groups and charities and other organizations that the people in our like tech group are connected to, and they're just not being utilized. And so you kind of keep saying like, well, you know, you want to start a digital hub with all this funding you've got from the NHS, great. Are there any digital, has anyone spoken to anybody yet? And it just doesn't happen. So I totally see what you're saying, like even though the permission is there to explore a really different avenue for something, and the autonomy is there to do that, the kind of the experience and the practice is so ingrained, it's really hard to shift people out of the way that they've always worked. And sometimes I feel like I'm hitting my head against a brick wall, because it feels really like all progress feels really painstaking, but that also means that all progress feels really amazing, because like even though it's really small, it feels like such a big win because you can see how big a shift it is for people. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that all of this is really relative to your experience, and like if you're trying to change the system of how your own 5-person organization does its hierarchy, that's much easier. It's still very hard, but it's infinitely easier than trying to change the hierarchy within an organization like NHS Scotland. And like so the kind of the gains that you're looking at would be completely different, I think. That's just my perspective, that's not like CIA's perspective, but I think that it's definitely a different kettle of fish, and I think there's a lot that could be done there, but it would look very different, I think, to what we're doing at CIA.
There's a book that I've read, I think I read it about 7 years ago, and then I've been recommending it to loads of different people, and I thought I actually need to remember the details, so I've just finished rereading it, and it's Orbiting the Giant Hairball. And I first read that when I was in my last job in local government, and I just loved it, because basically the metaphor is you've got the hairball of an organisation, and every hair is every decision or policy that's ever been created. And even when you reorganize the organisation, you never take hairs away, you just add more hairs to it. So the gravitational mass of the hairball grows. And basically, in order to be creative or innovative, you need to make a decision about whether you need to leave the hairball altogether or whether you want to try and orbit the hairball. So if you kind of if you've got shared purpose and shared values, then it kind of works that orbiting is the right thing to do. Whereas I suppose if you disagree with what the organisation is trying to do, then you're just going to zoom off into space, and that might be the best thing. But that kind of really helped me, I think. Just there's a chapter in the book near the end where he has an experience, the person that's written it, and he said basically from that experience he learned not to try and change the hairball again, but just to try and help people orbit it or midwife them out of it, I think his phrase is. And I suppose I've been thinking kind of to what extent do you need to try and change the hairball, or to what extent can you help create the conditions to either orbit it yourself or help other people orbit it? And to what extent can you maybe change bits of the hairball? Is it actually an either or there might be bits where you could change part or untangle part of a hairball, but you still need to orbit the rest of it because there'll be things outside your control that you can't change. But I think that made it, I think it had a kind of powerful impact for me in terms of that learned helplessness thing, because you think, well, even though the hairball's there, I've still got a choice about whether I get sucked into it or about what I can do to try and orbit it, without necessarily just feeling like I've given up, if that makes sense.
And I have to say that really, I'm going to go, it's very rare I would go and hunt out a book to read, but I think I might do it because automatically I can see it now, kind of, there's a hairball with other hairballs that are a wee bit attached, and actually part of the job is orbiting maybe other hairballs we're not attached to and trying to attach them in some ways or kind of build a bit of space. So I think I think what you're talking about really resonates with kind of that tangledness and actually being on the outside of it, kind of working with other hairballs, kind of. Thanks.
Just a related thought as well that occurs to me is, it seems to me that there's not one right way to try and influence in this sort of space. You know, so let's imagine that we're all of a single mind. Well, there's those that, because of what's going on in their life and their position, the things they feel strong at and so on, will want to influence in one way, and those that might want to do it in another. So I'm saying this because at certain points in time, I found myself frustrated with some people that I would have articulated went too directly on the offensive, like they were just creating antibodies. But I think my reflection at this moment in time is that, so that as the only tactic isn't enough, but maybe there is a place for good cop and bad cop. Maybe that tactic is an important part of getting the conversation on the table. And so I just wonder if one of the possible traps for any of us to avoid is the thought that, you know, there's a right way to do it. There is only our way of doing it, and all we can do is work in our own individual practice and try and learn from others. Maybe.
I think that is the case because I think at the heart of our thesis as an organisation of how we construct this way of working is that it depends entirely on who is in the room. Depends on who's in the organisation. Collective impact agency would be a completely different beast if it didn't have, like, even just one of us left the space and someone different came in, it would change the dynamic completely. And I think there are various different ways of working that would adapt accordingly. So it is, by its nature, I think it depends entirely on the context, the person, their history, who they are, who they want to be, the kinds of things that they're interested in doing. So by its very nature, will always be different in every single context because human beings are different.
I'm conscious we've got 2 minutes left, but that's 2 minutes that we can devote to continuing to talk. So,
in which case, I just want to briefly highlight something that I think has been mentioned in chat, and that I think is crucial to this conversation outside of the time allocated, is scalability. I mean, that is important, and something that is also an area that I'm researching into. You know, to what extent, and I think, Andy, you made that point very clearly, you know, to what extent can we think that the systems and structures that we're talking about as enabling can be extended to, you know, include a number of individuals. I mean, there comes a point where there has to be a limit. I think I'm interested in researching and in understanding better where the limits are and who has tested those limits. We need to perhaps work to a smaller scale overall, is one proposition I'm making, and I'm harboring, and I don't know if anybody else thinks the same.
There's 2 points. There's sort of the point that Andy spoke about, and then Karen's one about sort of using hierarchy to move to more non-hierarchical, one that you put in the chat. I was reading a book recently not to do with kind of work and stuff, but there's some relevant stuff. It's called How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. And it gave examples in that around kind of the move from kind of to less dominant form of society around capitalism. And I remember one example that struck me as a universal basic income, where in the short term, that kind of helps the capitalists out. Because if you think about it, if you're an arch capitalist, you want to pay people as low wage as possible in order to maximize profits. But that's not sustainable, because if you don't pay people enough money, then they won't have any money to buy stuff, which is also the fuel for the capitalist economy. So if you introduce a UBI, it kind of helps them out in the short term. Yet in the long term, it's a move towards a less capitalist society, because everyone's kind of got that basic income and are less sort of dependent on doing jobs that exploit them and so on and so forth. I won't kind of lecture you about it. So I think it's kind of okay to kind of use perhaps short-term tactics that might support one thing if you're thinking about a longer-term strategy. And that thing about scalability, I remember I was on a course on asset-based community development with Cormac Russell, and someone asked him about scaling ABCD, and he said he prefers to use the word proliferate rather than scale, which I don't know if that's Cormac's interpretation, but my interpretation of that is a bit like what I was kind of saying about the dandelion earlier, in terms of, spread some seeds, and some of those seeds will land and some of those won't. But let's try, but kind of, if they do, then they can kind of carve out that space themselves. And the more seeds that spread and the more that kind of grows, and the more something will kind of proliferate that way, rather than perhaps thinking in the traditional ways of scale. So that's kind of my two thoughts on these two different things that came